London, the most influential capital city on Earth. Grey skyscrapers, red buses and black taxis. This is truly a concrete jungle. And for a Norfolk boy like me who's used to the farms of East Anglia and the rolling hills of Wales, this feels far from home. I have spent the last year visiting London to search out some of the more hidden historic sites located down the busy streets. My goal is to shine a light on the lesser known historic sites dotted around the Greater London area. You may have seen my previous videos of London, but I have compiled each place together in one big documentary for your viewing pleasure. Every place I have visited is within walking distance and almost every place is free to visit. Some sites on my list are better known than others, but are still often overshadowed by the more popular landmarks on the London skyline. In my journey I have discovered church ruins down small alleyways, hoards of medieval arms and armour, and ancient Roman temples buried deep underground. So embark on this adventure with me, as I show you 40 minutes of some of the most incredible London historic sites that you may have never heard about, and reveal their grand history and place in the history of London. This is the Hidden Historic Sites of London. We start our adventure on Mark Lane. Tucked away between tall glass business complexes stands the ornate medieval tower of All Hallows, Steyning. There is currently some considerable construction work going on around the tower, which has revealed the church's original Anglo-Saxon crypts, making this church even older than we previously thought, and indeed, All Hallows was likely one of the first churches of Saxon London. The word Steyning means stone in Old English, notable because most churches would have been made of timber construction during this time. The church was likely rebuilt in the 12th century, and the 14th century tower is now all that remains. It is amazing to think that, around 700 years ago, the tower would have likely been one of the tallest buildings on the medieval skyline. Yet now, it is dwarfed in comparison to its new noisy neighbours. Walking a little south, we stumble upon the ruins of another church, St Dunstan's. Named after a 10th century monk, this church narrowly survived the Great Fire of London, whereafter it was given a new tower and steeple by Sir Christopher Wren. Then in 1941, the church was bombed by the Luftwaffe during World War II, and remains today as a hollow skeleton. St Dunstan's still continues to shine with beauty, now a stunning example of horticulture, hosting a plethora of both local and tropical plants. Unfortunately, as I visited in winter, I couldn't get to see these in bloom, but it is still a lovely place to sit down, rest for 5 minutes, and watch this little island of reclaimed nature in this busy city. Over the bridge and turning right, we arrive at the Grand Cathedral of Suffolk. Not exactly hidden, granted, but when people think of a London cathedral, they most certainly think of St Paul's. Suffolk Cathedral is tucked away between giant modern buildings and keeps its historical treasures of intrigue close to its chest. The first known religious building on these grounds was a small Saxon convent, and has been a monastic site ever since. However, its roots go even further back to some 2,000 years ago, originally being part of a Roman settlement over the water from Londinium, the first settlement which of course has now become London. In 1106, the church was given an elevated status, becoming an Augustinian priory. Suffolk, alongside Westminster and St Bartholomew, a place that we will surely visit later in this video, grew to become one of the 3 great monastic churches to have survived the tumultuous history of London's past. Here we see the remarkable slice of over 2,000 years of history all in one area. The red sign showing us the remnants of a Roman road, a Norman priory foundation, possibly a 13th century stone coffin, and later 18th century brick kilns. A short walk west, and we find the ruinous remains of Winchester Palace. Only this corner of wall remains, boasting a grand circular rose window which would have bathed the multi-level medieval hall in sunlight. Winchester Palace used to be one of the largest and most opulent buildings in all of medieval London. The palace was built in the early 12th century and was home to the bishops of Winchester, as the name suggests. And it survived for over 600 years before a fire gutted the site in the 19th century, and it was not rebuilt. On our way to our next stop, we pass a reconstruction of Shakespeare's famous Globe Theatre, opened to the public in 1997, my birth year. The original Globe Theatre was built around 700 feet away from this fine reconstruction. The first theatre was constructed in 1599 by Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, but was gutted by fire when a prop cannon misfired during a performance of Henry VIII. Hopping over the river again, and a short distance past St Paul's, lays the ruins of Grey Friars Church. Once a giant monastic building, it was the second religious house to be founded in England by the Franciscan monks, known for wearing grey robes. The church boasted a university which held an extensive library, as London was one of the three main university cities of medieval England, the others of course being Cambridge and Oxford. The church was functional on this site from 1225 to 1538, where it fell to the dissolution of the monasteries under the reign of King Henry VIII. These are the walls of Roman Londinium. Although heavily amended over the centuries, the fact that these walls have stood the test of time and are still here today is an incredibly rare and fascinating achievement. The walls we see here are part of a Roman fort located on the western part of the city, known now as the Barbican Estate. The name Barbican comes from the Low Latin word Barbicana, which referred to a fortified outpost or gateway. This fort was built during the aftermath of Boudicca's Iceni or Iceni rebellion, which saw Londinium razed to the ground, and these were the first section of defensive walls to be built around the town. Before these fortifications, an earth bank and ditch encircled the Roman settlement. Later, in around 200 AD, city walls were built to surround the rest of Londinium. This quick reconstruction program saw Londinium become the new provincial capital of Roman Britain, replacing the old capital Camulodunum, which is now Colchester. The Roman walls were later adopted by the Normans, who continued to improve the defences of London with the construction of a grand castle by the river's edge, now named the Tower of London. This section of the Roman walls are considerably remarkable due to the fact that they had been hidden for centuries. During World War II, this area of London was extensively bombed by the Luftwaffe due to the industrial buildings which were situated here. The destruction of these factories unveiled this segment of Roman wall, which has been heavily modified over the centuries as the walls have been incorporated into other buildings, which are now also gone. If you're particularly interested in the ancient Roman history of London, hold steadfast, as I have two more Roman sites to show you in this video, so I'll be discussing the Roman history of London in much more depth as the video progresses. Here, nestled between tall modern buildings, we see the ancient ruins of something that looks very much out of place. These stone arches are the remains of Eling Hospital. Once part of a much larger medieval complex, the hospital was commissioned and built by William Eling, a local merchant who became considerably wealthy from trading in the prosperous city of London. He decided, rather generously, to give back to his local community in an act of great charity. And after noticing the growing population of blind homeless people along the streets, he decided to erect a hospital to house and care for them. This would be a permanent shelter for the blind homeless, regardless of gender, and grew to also accept paralysed priests and other people of unfortunate circumstances. The hospital was built in 1331 AD, housing around 32 patients. Soon after it opened, it tripled its occupation to look after over 100 people. What survives today is the ground floor of the hospital's chapel tower, with arches in every direction which would have led into the chapel's nave, various corridors and dormitories. The hospital was closed down by decree of the dissolution of the monasteries by King Henry VIII in the early 16th century, and the property was granted to Sir John Williams, Master of the King's Jewels. However, on Christmas Eve, only a year after being handed over to its new owner, the hospital burnt down, and the remains were quickly quarried and the stone was sold for the construction of various other local buildings. The ruins are situated next to a surviving portion of the ancient Roman wall. However, most of the architecture you see was built during the Middle Ages and much later. Indeed, as we follow these walls westwards, we naturally pass several church ruins, and courtyards where churches used to sit. The detached tower of St Albans, with its nave now long lost to time, is one of these unfortunate churches. St Albans was originally a medieval church, which was rebuilt in 1634. Only 32 years later, it was destroyed in the Great Fire of London, but afterwards was shortly rebuilt in the Gothic style that you see today. The nave was once again destroyed by the Luftwaffe bombing raids of the Second World War, and this time the ruinous remains were cleared and only the tower survives today. However, there is one medieval church in particular that survives as a marvel to Norman architecture. Just across the road from the infamous meat market of Smithfield, I give you the Church of St Bartholomew the Great. The story goes that an Augustinian canon or monk named Rahir had a vision of an ethereal winged beast transporting him to London, where he was told to build a chapel on a specific site. Upon receiving this story, King Henry I of England granted the monk the land to erect this chapel, and construction began in 1123 AD. The church quickly developed a reputation for having the ability to cure serious ailments such as disabilities, and this newfound celebrity status saw the church elevate into the grand mini-cathedral that we see today. The nave, high altar, and ambulatory is said to mimic that of Norwich Cathedral, one of the most important and prominent medieval cathedrals at the time, and the Romanesque arches do well to push this theory. The church doubled as a hospital, much like the previously mentioned Eling Hospital. However, St Bartholomew's appears to have miraculously survived the dissolution of the Monasteries Act. That is, however, until 1543, where the church was ransacked and half of the monastic building complex was subsequently demolished. The church escaped the destruction of the Great Fire of 1666, but over the centuries since the dissolution, the church gradually lost favour in the public eye, and continuously reduced its staff. One particularly interesting part of the church nave is the internal oriel window, an architectural feature usually seen on the exterior of grand late medieval and Tudor halls. It is said that this window was built so that the 16th century prior Bolton could keep an eye on the working monks during the day. Over time, St Bartholomew's lost its medieval belfry tower, instead featuring this later brick replacement. In fact, we can imagine the original size of the church due to the surviving eastern range of the cloister, which would have formed a square attached to the length of the nave. The stone bottom half of the gatehouse marking the entrance to the church's courtyard today is believed to be the original West End entrance of either the nave or the cloister corridor. This would make St Bartholomew's roughly 2/3 of the size of nearby giant St Paul's Cathedral. A short walk from the church, through the Smithfield Meat Market, and up St John's Lane. This will be a vital hint for our next stop. Say hello to the St John's Gate. This Tudor gatehouse was built in 1504 and stood as the southern entrance of the Clerkenwell Priory, which was a medieval monastic house and also the English headquarters of the Knight of the Order of St John, also known as the Knights Hospitaller. The monastery on this site was originally established in the 1140s, after the financial and political successes that the order experienced due to the Crusades. In classic Tudor fashion, much of the interior foundations and walls were built of brick, with a stone facade to give the impression of solidified grandeur and fortification. After the dissolution of the monasteries, the Order of St John was also dissolved and the priory fell out of use. Centuries of neglect and deterioration meant that the majority of the original Tudor stonework of this gatehouse had been long gone, either quarried out and sold, or fallen down, or looted. As such, much of the stone facade you see today is thanks to a reproduction project carried out in the Victorian era. My next destination is one of the strangest historical sites I have personally ever been to. The site in question is hidden deep below the ground, in a basement of a giant modern building which features an art installation which kind of gives us hints to what lies below. buried deep below the ground and hidden from sight for some 1,800 years. These are the foundationary ruins of the Mithraeum. A Mithraeum is a Roman temple dedicated to Mithras, a controversial late Roman god. The host of the ruins politely asks that you don't film this site, but after a friendly conversation with the staff member discussing the purpose of my channel, the staff kindly let me get a few short clips. The temple was believed to have been built in the mid-3rd century AD, and despite being named as the Temple of Mithras, artifacts found on site led to the temple being dedicated to multiple Roman gods as far as we can tell, such as Mercury, Minerva, and Venus. At the time of the temple's construction, the River Thames was much wider and the bank of the river would have been situated right next to the walls of the temple. The Mithraeum was also purposely partially built underground to represent the cave where Mithras was said to have engaged in a battle to the death with a bull. Now, if you enjoy museums featuring medieval arms and armour, today's last historic site will surely interest you. The Wallace Collection features a wide variety of artefacts and paintings, as well as art from all different types of material, but I visited here for one reason and one reason only: the armour. From swords, warhammers, poleaxes, mail hauberks and full suits of armour, the Wallace Collection has it all. A medieval fanatic could spend days marvelling at all the beautiful 15th and 16th century artefacts on display, also featuring incredibly rare examples from as far back as the 14th century, like these hourglass gauntlets. This is the armour of Sir Thomas Sackville, a stunningly ornate harness made by London's Greenwich Armouries, one of the most high-profile bespoke 16th century armouries in Europe. A gentleman in the movie props industry in America recently assisted in rebuilding a replica of this harness in all its 16th century glory, and the vivid blues and golds being brought back to life shows how incredible this armour would have been in its heyday. The main feature of the Wallace Collection's armour section is a mounted knight in full polished armour, even including the steel horse armour as well. This is the A21, a beautiful harness from the 1480s, built for equestrian use. The harness is in the German Gothic style, as suggested by the typically 15th century Gothic fluting which features all over almost every component of the armour. It is thought to have been built by the famous German armourer Ulrich Rams, but the gauntlets are a Victorian reproduction. The total weight of the full harness is calculated to be around 27 kilograms, with an additional 10 kilograms added for the mail. And when suspended from the body correctly, as you may have seen from my recent video, How a Knight Shall Be Armed, you'll know that the knight will retain almost full mobility, and the weight of the armour won't really impede the knight's dexterity and agility, but of course the stamina will be affected. A full suit of 15th century armour like this is incredibly rare, and indeed this harness is a composite, meaning it is a collection of various artefacts built up to create a full harness which could have existed at the time. It is believed to have come from the Freiburg family, who owned a castle in Bavaria which featured its own armoury. The collection within the armoury was dispersed in the 1850s, and with thanks to a variety of collectors and museums, the individual components have been pieced together to rebuild this suit of Gothic field armour. I will most certainly be discussing the A21 harness more in its own dedicated video. We are going subterranean once again as we explore the remains of a Roman amphitheatre. This is Londinium's very own Colosseum, accessible by the Guildhall Arts Museum next to London's medieval Guildhall, and only a small section of the amphitheatre has been excavated. Due to this, it's difficult to get an idea of the sheer size of this monumental building, but on ground level, the circumference has been marked out on the tiled plaza of the Guildhall. Although London was never a capital of Roman Britain, it quickly became a large and influential city by the 2nd century AD. The first Roman settlement here was erected in around 47 AD, 4 years after the initial invasion which began on the south coast. By 70 AD, the first amphitheatre was built on this site, having originally been built of timber construction. By the first half of the 2nd century, the amphitheatre was greatly enlarged with tall stone walls and many grand entrances encircling the theatre. It is understood that the new amphitheatre could hold an audience of around 6,000 spectators. At the time, Londinium's entire population was estimated to be around 20 to 30,000 people. For several centuries, the amphitheatre would have been roaring with excited crowds. However, by the 4th century, it is understood that the amphitheatre became abandoned as the Romans began to lose their grip as a ruling powerhouse in Europe. Around this time, many other large buildings in Londinium, such as the Forum and the Barracks, were also neglected, and over the centuries that followed, they were gradually stripped of their building materials which were used to construct houses and farmsteads in the local area by the Saxon period. For our second site, we are hopping forward in time to the Tudor period. This place is called the Charterhouse. Situated just a stone's throw from Smithfield, the Charterhouse is a complex of historical buildings ranging from the 14th century and onwards. This building began life as a medieval priory, founded by the Carthusian Order, a religious house which was a breakaway from the Benedictine Order. The priory was built in 1371 on the site of a Black Death burial ground, which had been dug and subsequently filled with dead bodies in 1348. The Carthusians led a very humble existence, which was evident in the only surviving wing of the cloisters. Here you can see a door which would have once been an entrance to a monk's cell or living quarters. A small and basic room where the monk would mostly sleep and meditate. A hole beside the door would have allowed servants to bring the monk food, without distracting him as he meditated or prayed for long hours. The architecture you see today is largely Tudor, as after the priory's dissolution in 1538, the various monastic buildings were auctioned off to a private buyer. It is said that the last prior of a Carthusian monastery named John Houghton refused the dissolution, and this was seen as directly speaking against the king's word. He was subsequently charged with treason and executed. The form of execution for treason at this time was hang, drawn and quartering. After Houghton was executed and disembodied, his arm was said to have been nailed to the wall of one of the London gatehouses as a warning to others who dare speak against the king. A further 10 monks who followed Houghton were taken to the nearby Newgate prison, which had a reputation for being a notoriously grave place to be sent to. 9 of the monks subsequently died from starvation, and the 10th was executed 3 years later at Tower Hill. These 11 monks later became remembered as the Carthusian martyrs of London. Later in the 16th century, the property was purchased by Thomas Howard, 4th Duke of Norfolk, who renovated the building further to keep up to date with modern architectural trends. He then renamed this building to Howard House. During his time spent on house arrest here, after allegedly scheming to marry Mary, Queen of Scots, he turned the cloister courtyard into a formal garden and a tennis court. Howard was found guilty of treason and executed in 1572. However, he was given the honour of being sentenced to death by beheading, a form of execution reserved for nobles, despite the process of hanging, drawing and quartering being reserved especially for treasoners. It is now time to escape the rain, at least for a moment, as we retreat to a church just north of the River Thames. This is the Church of St Magnus the Martyr, hidden in the shadow of London Bridge. And it is indeed London Bridge that we will be discovering today. Not the current one which you can see now, but the original 15th century bridge that was used in the Middle Ages. If you are not new to my channel, you'll already know that I have a video dedicated to London Bridge, which goes into a lot more detail than I will do here, so feel free to check it out. Unknown to many, this church houses an impressively large model, which is a loose reconstruction of the medieval bridge. It is impossible to know exactly what this monumental bridge truly looked like, as there is little reliable evidence and contemporary artwork is questionable at best. But, based on the written descriptions and using the artwork as a guide, and using this beautiful wooden model which was built by David T. Agger in 1987 and gifted to the church, we can at least imagine what London Bridge used to look like in the medieval period. During the age of the Romans in Britain, the first bridge crossing the Thames was believed to have been a pontoon-style construction, with a more permanent bridge being made later in the latter half of the 1st century AD, as Londinium began to expand and a second Roman settlement was now growing on the south bank of the river. The first bridge may have been destroyed during the sacking of Londinium by the Iceni tribe during the Boudiccan revolt in around 60 AD, but was believed to have been quickly rebuilt along with the rest of the city. The Roman army often used this bridge as a vital link between Kent and the rest of Britain. Substantial quays and docklands were erected around the bridge as Roman Londinium entered its heyday in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. However, following the fall of the Roman Empire in around the 4th and 5th centuries AD, it is likely that the bridge fell into disrepair and was no longer crossable by the time of the Saxon period, with the River Thames now acting as a boundary between the kingdoms of Mercia and Wessex. Over the centuries that followed, several attempts may have been made to rebuild the crossing over the River Thames in order to help protect the settlements along the river from the near-constant Viking raids. But the first written reference of the Saxon bridge over the River Thames was in 1016 when mentioning further Viking raids. The Saxon bridge was made of timber, and after the Norman conquest the bridge was repaired and rebuilt multiple times, with King Henry II creating a monastic guild called the Brethren of the Bridge, who oversaw all required work to keep the bridge in a functional state. Following the murder of Thomas Becket in 1170, King Henry II built a new bridge dedicated to Becket in 1176. This was the beginning of the bridge that we see reconstructed in this model, a gigantic construction project of monumental proportion, unlike any other bridge in Britain at the time. Scores of arches all built in stone supporting multiple gatehouses and a stone chapel dedicated to Becket the Martyr at the halfway point above the river. From its immediate construction, houses were built along the bridge with the rent from these dwellings used to partially fund the building work. The rest of the funding of the bridge came from the kingdom-wide increase in wall taxes. In total, the length of the bridge was roughly 282 metres long, and had 19 piers which were all supported by nests of timbers rising up from the riverbed. Over the next 2 centuries, London Bridge grew to host multiple storey houses along its entire length, creating an avenue from one side to the other. Shops and market stalls were also present on the bridge, along with festivals and celebrations on holidays and days of worship. On each side, steps leading down to the river would allow ferrymen to embark and disembark from the southern and northern shores. Indeed, ferrying was a massive industry in the Middle Ages, with multiple guilds dedicated to keeping a fair trade for the townspeople and visiting pilgrims. The power of the ferryman guilds became all too real, as by the end of the 18th century, London Bridge was still the only bridge spanning the River Thames in London. This was largely because the ferryman guilds knew that they would immediately lose a sizable chunk of their business if any new crossings were built. So they consistently campaigned against any new construction plans, and some would-be construction firms were allegedly bribed to dissolve their plans for any new bridges. In 1799, a competition was finally opened to design a replacement bridge, with the original medieval London Bridge destined to be demolished once a new crossing had been built. After considering multiple designs, John Rennie's proposal for a 5-arch bridge made of granite was accepted. By 1831, a new London Bridge had been officially opened, and the old medieval bridge was demolished. As the use of automobiles became more popular in the late 19th century, surveys on the bridge found that the eastern side was gradually sinking more than the west side, which resulted in a decision to rebuild a new bridge fit for the modern traffic. The old new London Bridge was auctioned off and purchased by a Missourian entrepreneur named Robert P. McCulloch for the sum of $2,460,000. The bridge in London was systematically dismantled block by block and shipped to its new home at Lake Havasu City in Arizona. Onwards now to St. Catherine's Docks, and this is certainly a spectacle you don't see every day. Say hello to the Andalusia, a replica of a 17th century Spanish galleon. Now, I should caveat at this point, by the time you're watching this video, the Andalusia has sailed back to its home in Spain, but I wanted to include it in this video as London often has many weird and wonderful ships grace the River Thames, from warships to ornate gondolas. So it is important to keep an eye out at St. Catherine's Docks to see what curiosities may be chartered to visit the River Thames. For the last 15 years, the Andalusia has been sailing all around the world in near constant voyages all year round, making port in 4 continents across the globe as a widespread cultural project, informing the public of Spanish shipping during the 17th to the 19th centuries, as well as the history of tall ships in general and all the work that goes into sailing and ship upkeep. The Andalusia is one of 3 remarkable reproductions of historical ships, alongside the Nao Santa Maria, a replica of a 15th century discovery ship, and the replica of the Neo Victoria, an early 16th century ship which claimed to be the first to circumnavigate around the world. The Neo Victoria was the first of the three, having been constructed in Spain in 1991. The original left the Spanish city of Seville in 1519, and returned to the same port in 1522 after successfully sailing around the Earth. Between 2004 and 2006, the replica has completed almost 27,000 miles, and continues to sail the seas to this very day. The Santa Maria replica is a massive full-scale 200-ton ship built predominantly using pine wood, and is a tip of the hat to the original Neo Santa Maria, which was famously sailed by Christopher Columbus in 1492. Built in 2017, the ship began its sailing career by travelling around the several ports in France and Spain, but expanded its voyaging capabilities by navigating the Atlantic in November of 2018. The Andalusia is the largest of the three sister ships, having been built from 2009 to 2010 in the Spanish port of Huelva. Weighing in at over 500 tons, measuring 160 feet long and boasting 4 masts holding 6 sails, this is indeed one of the largest replica ships currently navigating the oceans today. Since its maiden voyage, it has travelled over 48,000 miles and has docked in over 100 ports worldwide. Being the largest ship with the most interior space, the Andalusia was able to go above and beyond in terms of a cultural tourist attraction, as the interior has been decked out to be a mobile museum, providing a comprehensive history of tall ships throughout the centuries, showcasing a plethora of historical memorabilia such as cannon, chambers, living quarters and tools, as well as discussing the realities of living on board a 17th century galleon. This gives the public a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to step on board a replica historical tall ship and view multiple levels from the forecastle to the lower decks. The Andalusia has many achievements under its belt, having conquered oceans such as the Pacific, Indian and Atlantic, as well as navigating the Mediterranean, the Red, the Aegean, the Caribbean and the South China Sea, not to mention successfully navigating through the Bosphorus Strait and the Panama Canal. The three ships are owned by the Neo Victoria Foundation, a historical maritime organisation who delves into experimental archaeology to help bring history alive for the public through the use of hands-on teaching methods and awe-inspiring functional reconstructions. Unfortunately, the rain has not subsided, but I will continue my journey regardless. We are hopping across Tower Bridge once more to the south bank, and following the river east to our next location. Finally, out of the hustle and bustle of central London, we reach a quiet area called Bermondsey. Here, well hidden amongst the domestic houses, lays a small yet very interesting historic site. These walls peeking out of the ground are the ruins of a medieval manor house. But not just any manor. This was once one of the homes of King Edward III. Edward III was one of the most prominent and influential kings of all English history. He lived through the Black Death and reigned for 50 years until his death in 1377. At the age of just 17, he crushed the uprising of Roger Mortimer. He later began the 100 Years' War between the English and the French, to which he oversaw a huge success in the first half of the conflict, with notable English victories being Crécy and Poitiers. And in 1338 he negotiated a truce with Scotland to mark the end of the Scottish War of Independence. This manor house was just one of his many London dwellings, possibly a hunting lodge, but more likely a home for him to practice one of his favourite hobbies, falconry. The building would have originally had a moat with a drawbridge, but over time the manor fell out of use, and the moat gradually silted up, and during the 1800s, the dilapidated remains were used as part of an industrial building. Today, barely anything survives of King Edward III's manor house, but we can get a sense of what it may have looked like if we were to travel a few miles south to Sevenoaks, where the medieval manor house of Ightham Moat continues to stand in all its glory today. Ightham Moat was likely built within a few decades of the manor at London, and remarkably has survived relatively unchanged throughout all these years, so the architectural style is believed to have been very similar, just on a smaller scale for Edward's home here in London. The final place we will be visiting today, and indeed the final place of this series, stands tall and proud upon a pedestal overlooking the River Thames, gazing upon the finance district of London, Canary Wharf. This grand ship is none other than the Cutty Sark. It is remarkable how many people don't even know this spectacle of the British Empire exists here in London for all to marvel at. Which is why, despite its size and dominance over the local landscape, it secures a spot in my list of hidden historic sites of London. The Cutty Sark is a British clipper ship built for the tea trade. Clipper ships were a type of mid-19th century merchant ship which had many sails and could achieve very fast speeds despite their large size. Built in Dumbarton, Scotland in 1869, the Cutty Sark was one of the last clipper ships ever to be built by the British Empire. By the 1860s, steam power was beginning to completely reimagine the capabilities of the shipbuilding industry, and steam-powered ships proved to be a faster and more efficient method of maritime trade. The Cutty Sark spent a few years travelling back and forth to China in the name of the tea trade, but once steamships replaced these routes, the Cutty Sark was instead used to trade wool in Australia. During one of these trade routes, the ship broke the world record for the fastest time sailing from Australia to Britain, and held this record for a further 10 years. By around 1880, steam-powered ships had also begun taking over the Australian trade routes. So the Cutty Sark was sold to the Portuguese Navy in 1895, and subsequently renamed the Ferreira. The ship was used to transport cargo for just under 30 years before being purchased by a retired British sea captain named Wilfred Dowman in 1922, who used it as a training ship in Falmouth, Cornwall. In 1954, the Cutty Sark was donated to the National Historic Fleet and put on display here at Greenwich in London, along with a purpose-built museum. And so that marks the end of my list of hidden historic sites of London. We've travelled through thousands of years, from the ruins of the Roman Empire to the maritime prowess of the British Empire. We have covered religious, military, trade, hospitality and royal sites, showing London's great historic place on the world stage. I hope you've enjoyed this 3-part series, and I will be seeing a lot more of one of these places featured, so stay tuned for upcoming adventures. But for now, thanks for watching.